we have been monitoring for the past few weeks this extremes or this very intense series of events starting from the north of Syria and developing into an all-out incursion around Syria. We have seen Syrian opposition troops taking over Homs, Hama, Aleppo, in the south, Dara, Deir ez-Zor, and so on and so on. And we've been hearing reports all day long about more and more advances. So this is an ongoing event in which we're seeing the Syrian regime kind of collapsing or kind of like dismantling in front of our very own eyes. So for this purpose, we brought in today Dr. James Dorsey, one of the best people to provide us with analysis about the implications of such an event and to talk about that. So I would like to start and to give the floor to James. James, thank you so much for joining us today. And the first question for you, James, if you can give me kind of a short intro, and short because we have a lot of questions to cover, but the short intro is, what are we seeing in front of us? What is it taking place in front of us?
I think, let me start off by saying there are more questions than we have answers. And we're on shifting ground. The sand is just moving as we speak. Having said that, what I do think we're already seeing and likely to see is a tectonic shift. This simply rewrites the geopolitics and the geopolitical map of the Middle East, particularly because, probably most importantly, it totally undermines the forward defense strategy of Iran. Iran's going to have to sit back and rethink a lot of its policies. It also undermines one crucial, but nonetheless one of three pillars, if you wish, of Iranian defense. One being its the axis of resistance. It's mostly non-state allies, but also Syria as a state ally, and makes it much more reliant on the other two pillars, one being ballistic missiles, the other being the nuclear program. And we don't know where that's going to go. It changes the balance in Lebanon. Hezbollah has already been weakened as a military force, possibly as a political force. I think that remains to be seen. But Syria was, in many ways, the conduit, both for weapon supplies as well as for funding, essentially money in suitcases. Now, with the lay of the land that we're seeing, certainly if Homs falls, that land bridge between Iran and Lebanon is gone. So, what that fundamentally means is that the balance of power in the Middle East has changed. Now, we're not there yet, but in some ways we are there yet already, because even if Assad survives this, and I would call that into question at this point. I think the momentum is one that we've seen this sort of momentum before in other situations, going back to 1975, Vietnam may have been past the point of no return, but that has to be seen. But even if that's not the case, what you will get is a severely weakened Bashar al-Assad at the very least, or, just to name one other option, an internal coup, that the knives are out for Bashar within his own entourage.
So let me kind of divide this discussion into sections. And the first one will be Syria, then we'll talk about Iran, then we'll talk about Lebanon and Hezbollah and Turkey and the jihadists and so on and so on. So let's focus about Syria. What we're seeing here is really an advancement that I would like you to first answer and say, is this a repetition of what we saw, or this is the real deal? This is really the collapse of the regime?
Look, it's a little bit early to say. Fact of the matter is, if you go through the history of all of this, is you had a 2011 popular uprising, which was one of those popular uprisings that initially did not call for the toppling of the regime. It called for reform. And it only started to call for the toppling of the regime, and it only started turning violent when the regime turned violent and also opened the doors of its prisons and let a lot of people out who were in prison on suspicion or because they were jihadists, Islamists, whatever it may be. When the conflict got frozen, the conflict basically got frozen, meaning that the regime occupied much of the country, but not all of the country, and had forced large numbers of people into rebel held areas in the north. That was never a sustainable situation. Uh, Basically, ultimately, long term, the options were secession, uh, return to the motherland, or renewed fighting. Secession wasn't an option, but primarily because a majority of those people in the north are not from the north. They are from Aleppo. They are from Hama. They were people who wanted to return to their homes. I think what most people, including myself, was taken by surprise is not so much that this offensive happened, and maybe not even the speed of it, but the brittleness of the Syrian military. The fact that it simply just, in a sense, fell apart, or is falling apart. Now, again, I want to say that with one degree of caution. It's very well possible, although the first indications wouldn't point in that direction, that Assad's going to put up his fight in Damascus, rather than fighting it along the M5 highway or in the east and so on. But if the initial reports are true that you're already seeing people leave Damascus, then even if that is Bashar al-Assad's intention, that may not be the way it works.
What kind of a Syria are we going to see in case Bashar is no longer there and the rebel groups are going to take over? Because we're talking about a coalition of many different groups. We're talking about U.S. troops on the borderline between Jordan, Iraq, and Syria. We're talking about the Kurds. We're talking about, to some extent, still ethnically or religiously divide between Alawites and Sunni. We're talking about still Shia and Hezbollah in Lebanon and so on. So, what kind of a Syria are we going to see emerging from this? And I'm saying, I know this is not still yet, but what a scenario that we might going to see do you think is most likely?
Simple answer is your guess is as good as mine. Fact of the matter is there are a number of issues here. The Let's start with Hayat Tahrir Sham. There's the debate of is Hayat Tahrir Sham and is Abu Muhammad al-Julani a reformed organization and reformed leader, or are we talking about a wolf in sheep's a wolf in sheep's clothes? I think the jury is out. Uh, the two things I would say about that is people change. I mean, it's the argument granted that Jelani used yesterday or day before yesterday in the CNN interview, but nonetheless, it's a fact. We all change, and so I would not totally rule that out. Second of all, he's been on this whatever you want to call it process of change, uh, deception, whatever you want to call it. He's been on this for I just need to plug in my computer. Sorry. Um, he's been on this for now 8 years, and I don't think you can ignore that. And there is a track record of, I mean, if you were in Syria today, in many ways, Idlib is where you want to be. That's where you got 24-hour electricity. You don't have it in Damascus for all practical matters. So I think that's a fact. But we don't know. It's been tested on a limited scale. That's one. Two. he's taking on now, or Hayat Tahrir Asham is taking on a much greater, uh, a much greater territory, a much larger population that he and those with him will have to administer, and we'll have to see how they do that. There's been all the reassurances towards the Alawites, towards the, towards Christians, towards other minorities. There have also been videos already appearing that point in another direction. Although I still think that overall, that message of endorsing diversity is the overall message. We really, if you look back at the last 10 days, have not had a lot of reports or any really credible reports of violence against minorities in
I
any
think
form or fashion.
that's in many ways was one
Uh,
of the biggest surprises for many. We didn't see so much violence in this. You mentioned that the collapse of the Syrian army was fast, but it was peaceful in a way. And I know it sounds there was fighting, but not to the
Absolutely.
extent that we thought it would be.
Absolutely. No, there was fighting is one thing. Taking revenge, taking it out on minorities, whether they're Alawites or others, is a different thing. And we haven't seen that, and we've seen Jolani speak out against it very clearly. And so I think that's a hopeful sign. We're going to have to, you're going to have to test that over a period of time. Also, what we're seeing in what seems to be a collapse of the regime is, on the one hand, Hayat Tahrir led forces coming out of the north, but it's not the Hayat Tahrir forces in the south and the east primarily, and certainly not in the south. So, what you mentioned early on, there's a coalition that's come together here that really is bound first and foremost by one thing: topple Bashar al-Assad. It's not necessarily toppled by, or it's not necessarily a vision, a unified vision for the future of Syria. On top of that, and I'm sure we'll come back to this when we go down your list of the various stakeholders and what their attitudes are. There's some talk within Hayat Tahrir Asham about decentralization or some degree of decentralization in Syria. And that again has serious consequences. For example, the status of the Kurds and Kurdish areas. But I'm sure we'll get into that later on.
Let's talk about those stakeholders. Let's start with the one that is considered to be the biggest loser, and that is Iran. Um, can you please, you mentioned this a little bit about their strategy, their defense doctrine. We also had a discussion on Thursday with Dr. Sina Azudi. We spoke about their nuclear doctrines, defense doctrine. We talked about their potential intervention in Syria, which surprised us that they didn't. Um, um, so can you tell me from your perspective, what is it that Iran is basically losing here with the collapse of the Assad regime?
Uh, well, it's losing, first of all, regional influence. But most importantly, I think from an Iranian point of view, its defense strategy is severely hampered. So depends on what you view, how you view the relationship that Iran has with various non-state actors, whether that's Hezbollah, whether that's the Iraqis, whether that's the Yemenis. Um, I'd put the relationship between Iran and Hamas in a different category in this regard. Um, so it depends on what you think the purpose of that is. Is the purpose to disrupt, export revolution, or is the purpose first and foremost a forward defense strategy? With other words, I don't want to fight my I don't necessarily want to fight my wars with my people. I want to fight them with other people, and I'd rather fight my wars on someone else's border, not on my border. And if that is the core of the raison d'etre from an Iranian point of view, of the axis of resistance, with other words, that alliance of primarily non-state actors and Syria, then this is the collapse of it. Hezbollah is severely weakened. Ultimately, Hezbollah probably will have to choose to emphasize its political activities rather than its military activities, and we'll see some degree of serious uh, disarmament. In addition to which, the flow of arms has now been, with the fall of Syria, been severely hampered. So it's left with the Iraqi groups, and it's left with the Houthis in Yemen. What it loses with Syria and with Hezbollah is the ability to pose a threat on Israel's borders, which was a key strategy, which was a key element of um, of Iranian strategy. Keep in mind that from an Iranian mindset, and granted, they've contributed to this, and that's not the point here. They look at the last 45 years as a continuous or largely continuous effort to topple and weaken, if not topple, the regime. And that's why this defense strategy was so important. I think the other thing to keep in mind also is, you know, why that why was the defense strategy built on those three pillars? Iran doesn't have an air force of any import. It doesn't have a navy of any import, really, because of sanctions over the decades. So it really needed to look for an alternative defense strategy, and that's why the loss of Syria, in addition to the weakening of Hezbollah, is just simply, this is a deadly blow.
I want to talk about that defense strategy in another question I'm going to ask. But first, we saw that Iraqi militias that you spoke about that have strong ties with Iran, it was reported that they were not intervening even though they were asked to. And I don't know how much of it is true versus disinformation, because there's a lot of that. But if that's the case, is that something that we should be pointing out from the perspective of the fact that Syria is fallen and the Iraqis militia are not interfering in favor, that Iran is losing its is basically influence also on those on that group as well? Is that the loss of Syria helps the case of Iran losing their influence on the Iraqi militias there were that she sponsored over the years?
Well, before I answer the question, it's unclear what's happening.
Yeah.
If you looked at reports last week, there were roughly the reports were that some 800 Iraqi militiamen had crossed into Syria. I don't think it really matters in that sense. And the reason why I say that is, and we'll probably come back to this when we talk about Russia, but it's also relevant in Iran. Beyond all the discussions of Iran being too engaged and weakened, Russia being engaged in Ukraine, and so on and so forth, and therefore not able to intervene in Syria. I think there's a much more fundamental reason, which is if you don't have an army on the ground, that is the Syrian army that's willing to fight and has the stomach for a fight, you're not going to be able to salvage them. So whether or not there are 800 Iraqis running around Syria or not doesn't make the difference. That's one. Two, I don't. Again, this goes back to, and these are very, as you well know, in a sense, ideological discussions when it comes to the Middle East. I don't think that Iran's relationships with its non-state allies are a Simon Says relationship. With other words, I tell you and you do. That's not to say that there's not a great deal of influence in those groups, but these groups also have degrees of interests of their own. And within an Iraqi context, it may very well be that many of these groups want to retain that Iranian backing because it's important for their positioning within Iraq. So I would be careful with jumping to conclusions.
Last question about Iran before we jump to the other stakeholders. Dr. Sina Zudi on Thursday, I asked him about the nuclear policy. Are we seeing a wounded tiger in the cage being pushed into changing their nuclear doctrine into basically moving from a phase of having the capacity to the phase of developing the bomb and literally holding the bomb? And his answer, well, was that it's been considered more than ever before. This when we discussed it was well, the events in Syria were taking place. Now I think the events in Syria are in a different place. When you see now the situation in Syria and how that impact the Iranian nuclear doctrine, where do you see this is going? Are we going to see a nuclear Iran in the upcoming years, or are we going to see an Iran that is more deterrent from moving towards that step of becoming a nuclear actor?
I think that the glass is half full or half empty. I heard Sinan on Thursday, and I thought he was very, very good, and I enjoyed it. And I don't necessarily disagree with him, but I can make the argument both ways. I can make the argument for a move towards a weaponization, and I can make the argument against it. Look, Tehran is no different from any other place. With other words, you have power centers, and those power centers are compete with each other, and they have competing views. So hardliners, uh, I think where Sinan is right is that the debate has shifted to a degree. There is now an open debate or a more open debate on whether or not to weaponize in Iran, whereas in the past it was accepted norm that Iran does not want a nuclear weapon, at least in the public debate. Um, I think that a lot on the decision of whether or not the Iranians would go towards weaponization is going to depend on one, the balance of power between Masoud Pezeshkian, the president, and the more hardline forces. It's also going to depend on U.S. policy. And we don't know what U.S. policies, at the end of the day, we really don't know what it's going to be. With other words, we know you have a cabinet of hawks when it comes to Iran. And interestingly, on Iran, maybe the one area, I mean, just as an aside, uh, the cabinet lineup that Trump has put together is cohesive or coherent, except for on the Middle East. Iran may be the one part of the Trump administration where there is coherence. And so we're probably going to see the maximum pressure campaign, but we may at the same time see an opening. Iran's going to be one major focus of Trump's U.S. Middle East policy, without question. And given who Trump is, given his record, given his somewhat delusional belief in his negotiating skills, he may want to give that a try. And it's not inconceivable that Iran would want to put that to the test. So, which means that even if the Iranians were to choose for weaponization, that may not be an immediate response. It may be down the line. I think the second issue is, if I can just very briefly, is Netanyahu. If you go back to Netanyahu's reasoning, why he accepted the ceasefire in Lebanon, there were three reasons. One of those reasons, which is the one least discussed, was focus on Iran's nuclear program. What changes? Does what happened in Syria change Netanyahu's perception of what he feels he needs to do? I don't know what the answer to that question is.
So let's move to the other stakeholders. And I wanna start with Russia. Um, Great question, Neil Quilliam asked. Why didn't they interfere? And the question is, maybe I'll ask it in a different way. Can or could they interfere? I mean, do they have the capacity, or was there something else in their intentions and motivation that stopped them from interfering? Maybe understanding that they can do better with someone else. So why do you think the Russians did not interfere in this situation?
Well, first of all, it's not that they did not interfere. We've seen Russian bombings of rebel positions over the last, whatever it is, 10 days. So it's not that the Russians have totally stood aside and done nothing. One, two, look, neither the Russians, even if they were, leave aside whether or not they have the manpower to do it, given reports of the North Korea, importing North Koreans for Ukraine. But leave that aside. Let's say that Russia, or for that matter, Iran, would want to intervene. If you have a crumbling army, national army, do you want to be out there on the ground fighting and putting your men at risk? I doubt it. It's a lost case, and it doesn't make you look very good. So beyond the fact that they may not have the capability to intervene, this may be a situation that they don't want to intervene. Now, the one thing that argues against that is that at this point, if the rebels succeeded in Damascus, Russia 2024 in Syria is the United States in Saigon in 1975. They're going to have to pull out in a real rush. And so the question is, and it's not clear to me, um, I don't think that Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, made it clear a couple of hours ago at the Doha Forum when he spoke. It's not clear to me what their assessment of the situation is. So you have, on the one hand, you have the call on Russian civilians to leave Syria and to do so on commercial flights. In other words, they're not putting in evacuation flights. And at the same time, you don't really see much of a withdrawal from either from the airbase near Latakia or from the port in Tartus. So, what do you use to define what their position is? I don't know.
What do the Russians have to lose in case of the collapse of the Assad regime?
They lose. This is their foremost military foothold in the Middle East. It's their military foothold in the Mediterranean. They may have here and there Sudan, whatever, but this is their major military post. The regime falls, the bases disappear. That's a major loss. It's a major loss both in terms of their positioning in the Middle East. It's a major loss in their positioning as a global power.
Some of the experts I spoke to mentioned that Ukrainian special forces slash intelligence were involved in helping the insurgency slash rebel forces fighting Assad. And the logic behind that was that if Russia collapsed, if Syria collapsed, the Assad regime collapsed, it will force Russia to make some concessions, maybe in regard to Ukraine, in order to keep those bases that you mentioned before. Do you see that kind of a situation involving that kind of linkage between Syria, Ukraine, that kind of a chessboard, international chessboard, or was it more simple than that, in which basically let's kill Russians where they are because that's going to help the cause in Ukraine? Because I'm talking about from the perspective of we know there was some sort of assistance and aid by the Ukrainians in Syria. So how do you see that playing?
Look, I tend to not give it a great deal of importance. first of all, the rebels are battle-hardened fighters. They're probably more battle-hardened in many ways than the Ukrainians are. You know the rebels. Well, that may or may not be true, but the rebels have now fought more than a decade of war, and so yes, there may have been advice, but I wouldn't attribute too much importance to that. I don't think that the rebels would cut a deal with the Ukrainians to keep the Russians in uh, in in Syria. So because that has some advantage for the Ukrainians in Ukraine versus Russia. I think that's all a bit far-fetched. So I would be very cautious.
Let me clarify the question. Is there a possibility that Russia, under pressure to keep their bases in the Middle East, will be willing to make concessions in Ukraine?
I doubt it. I don't see how at this point Putin is capable of making concessions in Ukraine. If anything, that we've seen no indication in anything that Putin has said recently that he would be willing to compromise on Ukraine. If anything, it was the Ukrainians who were starting to put forward compromise proposals. Again, if you listen to Lavrov tonight in Doha, uh, he wasn't giving a millimeter when it came to Ukraine.
Staying on Russia for a little bit, is there a situation in which Russia and Turkey are negotiating about those bases in order to maintain them? Or in the end of the day, it's going to be left with Russia kind of securing it on their own and finally maybe losing it for Syrian rebel forces?
Well, first of all, I don't see how Turkey is going to be the determining factor in whether or not a post-Assad Syria is going to uh, is so. With other words, I don't see how Turkey would be the major factor in determining what post-Assad Syria will do. Uh, Turkey, again, they're a major stakeholder. The Turks' interest, first and foremost, is in the north. It's the Kurds. Um, it certainly would like an Islamist regime. It would like to see Bashar go. Efforts to reconcile, somehow build a bridge over the last 2 years between Turkey and Syria, Erdogan and Assad have failed. Uh, there were talks as recently as mid-November that failed. The Russians, in fact, hardened their line in terms of uh, attitudes towards Turkey and Syria. The Russian Syria negotiator described Turkey as an occupying force and backed the Syrians on demanding a total withdrawal of Turkish forces from Syria. So I don't see, and on top of that, you're getting somewhat strained relations between Turkey and Hayat Tahrir, in part because Hayat Tahrir is thinking of some degree, potentially thinking of some degree of decentralization, which would again have effects on the Kurds in the north. So I don't see how the Turks are going to be the determining factor. Uh, Last but not least, we still, even despite the fact that Hayat Tahrir is in the lead in this military offensive, we still don't know what kind of government emerges in Damascus if Bashar is overthrown.
Talk about two other groups, the Kurds and the Hezbollah one. Let's start with the Kurds. How this situation impacting them, and what are we likely to see them doing?
Well, what I think you're already seeing is that the Syrian National Army, which is much more of a Turkish proxy than Hayat Tahrir is, has taken over Tal Rifat. I think you're going to see a push for Manbij. With other words, the the Turks may very well succeed with this in pushing the Kurds east of the Euphrates, which is what they want. you may or may not get a situation, if indeed Bashar al-Assad falls, uh, in which the rebels, or whatever rebel government or some internal coup within the regime, uh, take issue with the fact that Turkey has a buffer zone on Syrian territory. They will presumably want the full restoration of Syrian sovereignty over all of its land. So I think you've got some potential issues here. And in fact, depending on how Hayat Tahrir handles this, you've already started to hear reports that some assets of Hayat Tahrir in Turkey have been frozen, that you actually get an open hostile situation between the two.
Let's talk about Hezbollah in Lebanon. How is this situation impacting Hezbollah? And are we looking at this as an acceleration of the process of Hezbollah basically being diffused, or an acceleration of a process of Hezbollah basically being restored into a fighting force and supplied by Iran as kind of a contra to losing Syria? How do you see this situation with losing Syria and Assad regime impacting the relationship between Hezbollah and Iran?
I think it's one more body blow, one more serious body blow. Uh, I don't see, for multiple reasons, I don't see Hezbollah as a player in Syria anymore, nor do I see Hezbollah wanting to be a player in Lebanon. Let's keep in mind that Hezbollah dragged Lebanon into a war that has cost Lebanon dearly, and it will retain a significant popular base in Lebanon. But there are a lot of critics, and Syria is not Lebanon's war, much like many Lebanese feel Palestine is not their war. So, for on top of that, of course, you've had all the body blows, and Hezbollah has proven to be much more resilient than many people would have expected. So, by no means am I suggesting that one should write Hezbollah off, but I think that the world, in a sense, has changed for Hezbollah in the last several months, and that Syria is no longer on its radar, particularly given that, first of all, the loss of Syria is the loss of a major transit route for Hezbollah's needs, which is a further weakening. But second of all, in many ways, Hezbollah would have the same problem that Russians and Iranians have. If you don't have a national army willing to fight for its own country, you're not going to win this war. It's as simple as that, unless you want to become an occupying force.
We see a potential that this situation in Syria spill over to Lebanon in some way or form of, I won't say a civil war, but maybe more pressure on Hezbollah to disarm by the other groups.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I'd be careful with that. I think that Hezbollah, the pressure, Syria the Lebanese don't need Syria to put pressure on Hezbollah. The pressure's on anyways. So I don't see. I think this is more. I would think of this more in terms of the loss that Hezbollah has suffered in a line of serious losses and blows that it has suffered over the last several months, rather than that this is going to further push Hezbollah.
Do you see a situation in which the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah is weakening because of the situation in Syria?
Well, okay, this comes back to what we were discussing earlier. If Iran is forced to rethink its forward defense strategy, as I would describe it, with other words, its relationships and the value of having these non-state allies as a result of the fall of the Bashar regime, then by definition the relationship with Hezbollah changes. Now, I wouldn't write that relationship off, Again, Hezbollah is both a political organization and a military organization. What has been lost here at this point is primarily the military side of this. It still remains an influential political force, and that's influence that Iran would want to have, irrespective of whatever else.
Moving to other stakeholders, Turkey. This situation has been described by many as uh, is probably one of that favors Turkey and that is good for Turkey. How do you see the ongoing situation and the potential collapse of the Assad regime in terms from the Turkish perspective? Do they perceive it?
First of all, this has been an offensive that has been in the making for quite some time. It certainly has been in the making for at least the last 2 months. And the rebels were ready to go in October. And the Turks essentially delayed them. So this was not by definition that something they want to see. Uh, this could make Turkey, the kingmaker in Syria. It could benefit it tremendously, and it could backfire. And it's too early to tell. A lot, so a government in Damascus that were Islamically inclined, religiously inclined, but uh, capable of delivering goods and services, and therefore gaining a broader popular base, is something that would serve Turkey's and particularly Erdogan's interests. Whether the rebels can provide that is far too early to tell. As much as whether or not the whether or not what who's going to be in government and what that government is going to look like. The other part of it is that if you take Jolani's views, words at face value, then he's probably going to be in favor of Kurdish rights within Syria, which would put him at odds with Turkey. So I think this is a double-edged sword, and we don't know which side of the sword is going to have the upper hand.
When we look at Turkey and relations with other countries such as Iran and Russia in a post-Assad regime collapse, how do you see those relations taking place as being the kingmaker, as being the most influential one, and so on?
If it's the most influential one, we don't know. We don't know that for a fact. I think that the Iranians would have, by definition, have to, if it were the kingmaker, and if indeed this all works in Turkey's favor, the Iranians will have to deal with the Turks. Uh, it's as simple as that. For the Russians, the, the Russians are further. They're not part of the Middle East. They're not bordering on Iran as well as such. So, sorry, on Syria. So for them, this is a slightly different issue, and they may just simply move on, and take the loss and move on. The Iranians probably can't do that, and the Turks certainly can't. So those are, those I think is the way what the lay of the land would be. But again, it's early days.
I want to talk about another stakeholder, which was pretty big one a few years ago, and now we don't talk about him so much. We shows those jihadist group, and at the time it was ISIS, and now we don't hear about them. So two questions about that. The first one is, how do jihadist group around the world will see the situation in Syria? Are they going to be encouraged or discouraged? Um, is that going to impact their ideology? Is that going to impact their way of doing things? They might have seen this change of policy that they've seen of other groups in Syria as something that helped to achieve their cause. So maybe that will push them into a more moderation from that perspective. So how is the situation in Syria might impact jihadist group not necessarily in Syria. And the second one is, how is the situation in Syria going to impact jihadist group in Syria?
I mean, my first of all, my sense is, well, the jihadists are certainly not going to mourn the fall of Bashar al-Assad, and they're not going to mourn the fall of the Assad family. Don't forget that the enmity, certainly the enmity between Islamists and the Assad regime, goes way back, far earlier than the civil war. Go back to 1982 in Hama, when Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafiz al-Assad, cracked down on the Muslim Brotherhood. That's one. Two, uh, the evolution that we've seen, and need to wait and see whether that is sustained in terms of Hayat Tahrir and its sort of more practical, somewhat more moderate view. In some ways, we've seen within Qaeda too. And in terms of talking much more about governance. We haven't seen that with the Islamic State. So, in some ways, if it's not inconceivable that if Hayat Tahrir succeeds, one in toppling Bashar al-Assad, but then in administering a country that is ravaged by more than a decade of war and needs to rebuild, which is going to be one of the rebels' problems, that uh, reconstruction funds are not necessarily going to come pouring through the door. If once they take power, they're going to have to start and prove that they're serious about their more moderate approach. But if that does succeed, then I think that would have reverberations within the jihadist community, and you'd see a lot more, certainly, debate.
How do the situation will impact these balance of power between Syria and Israel? I mean, the Syrian-Israeli border has been one of the quietest one that Israel has, especially when it comes to the Golan Heights. Um, is the situation that's unfolding in Syria is one of those that is likely to lead to a potential escalation in tensions between whoever is going to take over Assad in Syria, or is that going to be leading to a continuation of the status quo when it comes to the Golan Heights and the ceasefire between Israel and Syria?
Well, you obviously probably know better than I do the debate in Israel right now. You know, which devil is the one you prefer, the one that you know, or the one that you don't know? Um, it depends. Look, my sense is that let's assume that you get a Hayat Tahrir-led government in Damascus. Israel's not going to be their foremost worry. They've got a long list of issues they need to deal with before they come to Israel. So I don't know that beyond rhetoric you would see a fundamental difference. I don't see that a Hezbollah, a Hayat Tahrir um, government would want to see an armed conflict with Israel, whether that's provoking Israeli airstrikes or an all-out conflagration. I think, on the contrary, they would go to great lengths to avoid that. Again, leaving the rhetoric aside. And you've seen in some instances in Aleppo and elsewhere, um, the Palestinian flag fly alongside rebel flags and Syrian flags and whatever. But I wouldn't give too much importance to that. So, with other words, I don't know, depending on who comes to power in Damascus, I don't know that we're really going to see a fundamental change. And of course, from the Israeli point of view, Syria was Iran. If the Assad regime is overthrown and replaced by some form of rebel governance, Syria no longer is Iran.
From the perspective of, again, from the Israeli perspective, is that going to impact their relations with Turkey?
Not necessarily. I think what's really going to impact relations with Turkey is Gaza and Palestine. That's particularly if you get a situation in which a lot of the friction that existed between Israel and Syria because of Iran, if that's taken out of the equation, Syria becomes far less important in the Israeli-Turkish relationship.
We're getting towards the end, so I want to touch on one more actor that we haven't discussed, and that is an actor that it's going to be with a change of leadership soon, and that is the United States. So let's talk about it from two perspectives. The first one is, I would say, the U.S. interest in Syria and how is the toppling of the Assad regime impacting those, and the second is Trump. What does that mean? Trump coming into office when he is in office, and instead of what the Assad regime that this administration had to face, Trump is facing a new regime or a new government or a new power situation in Syria. So let's talk about U.S. and their interest in Syria uh, within the perspective of this situation. How is this situation that is changing on the ground impacting U.S. interests in Syria?
First of all, the U.S. formulated its interest always as focused on rolling back the Islamic State. That was the reasoning for the 900 U.S. troops in the north of Syria. That was the reasoning why they were there. Trump, at one point, I forget exactly what the reference was, but made reference to Syrian oil, which is in areas where the Americans are positioned. But again, if you go back to what Abu Muhammad al-Julani has been saying recently, is one of the things that he's been saying has been emphasizing counterterrorism. With other words, the Islamic State. And uh, depending on whether or not the Islamic State or other jihadist groups uh, play a major role in a post-Assad Syria, I think we'll have to see. If there's one indication that I've seen, it's that the Uyghurs, who've been very important in the jihadist element of the Syrian opposition, have supported the overthrow of Assad and supported the Hayat Tahrir in their statements. So I think that's one thing. The other thing on Trump, uh, that it's going to be a very interesting policy issues. I don't think that Syria as such really was on Trump's radar until now. If anything, there was a very derogatory mark. I can't quote it now at the moment, but there was when at one point during his term as president, a, a fairly derogatory remark that he made about Syria. Uh, so, uh, but again, talking about the Middle East segment of his incoming administration being the least cohesive, you've got Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Security, who's been relatively, or if not more, pro-Assad, and certainly downplayed whatever allegations of abuse and torture and war crimes that are put against Assad. So we'll have to see what that policy is going to be. My guess is that at this point, if Iran is driven out of Syria, Syria becomes far less important uh, to Trump, and certainly if the Islamic State is not a major factor.
Well, James, we have 4 minutes to go. I want to ask you if you can give us kind of we really kind of went over all the stakeholders, and there's a lot, and I think maybe there's a few more that we didn't even touch. You mentioned the Uyghurs, so somebody mentioned today about China as a stakeholder as well, and we can go on and on. But we mentioned the
Sure.
main ones. Maybe we didn't touch a little bit Iraq, but that's okay, or Jordan, but that's okay. Let's try to put this into a kind of a conclusion point of view. So we kind of discussed where we're at. We kind of discussed the questions. Let me ask you this: where this is going? Where do you see this is going? I mean, if this is really the collapse of the Assad regime, and this is the end of it, what do you see happening in the upcoming 12 months?
Okay, before I answer the question, let me touch on one subject we have not touched on, and which is what you see in the Middle East. So if you're talking about Turkey, about Lebanon, about Jordan, about the Gulf states, which is there's on the one hand the question of stability and the fear that you get, some people have talked about a new Somalia, Syria falling apart. Uh, but there's also another issue, and that's the refugees. Turkey is home to 3 to 4 million Syrians, refugees, the single largest Syrian refugee community in the world. Lebanon, Jordan have very substantial numbers of refugees in Lebanon. I think you were up to 25% of the population. Those countries have an interest in refugees going back. It's very well possible that a rebel regime is going to be a more welcoming place for those people to come back than Assad Syria. Or put the other way around, more Syrians will be willing to take the risk of returning to Syria under a post-Assad regime rather than an Assad regime. And I think that's an important factor that one needs to keep in mind that we haven't. And it's one reason why you've seen border closures, whether that's between Syria and Iraq, whether that's between Syria and Jordan today or today. So that's one issue. If I were forced to place a bet, I would bet against Assad surviving this. I think beyond that, uh, I'd be very cautious with betting. It's there are too many unknowns for me in terms of I see the potential of things, but I can also see that. So, in other words, the potential that what Hayat Tahrir did fundamentally did in Idlib, it can repeat in Syria. I mean, that would be in and of itself uh, a positive outcome, but we don't know that that's the case. It remains still, but it's early days, and so I'd rather err on the side of caution.
Okay, so with that, we can conclude. And I just want to remind everybody, James also have a great blog podcast and an ongoing newsletter about called the Troubling World of Middle East Soccer. If you haven't been aware of it and registered to it, you should. It's one of the best one that they're out there. So I just put it
Thank
out
you.
there, and the word troubling is the
No,
word
a
that
turbulent world, yes.
turbulent world that we are seeing, and I think this is a great reminder to that. So thank you everybody who joined us on such a short notice on a Saturday. I definitely did not wake up thinking this is going to be the case, but then things happen. I want to thank James also for joining us today on a short notice. I want to thank everybody here who joined us as well. I hope you will be stay tuned for some of the other webinars we have that were actually planned in which we're following the Trump presidency and how that's going to impact U.S. foreign policy. We're going to be doing that in the next upcoming month until Trump takes office. So thank you, everybody. And that's it. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Oren, thank you.
Thanks.